How can a man enter the holds of slave ships and still believe every chained soul is beloved by God? Good evening, friends of St. Lives. Wherever you are listening, tell me your place and hour in your heart. If these stories comfort you, please subscribe and join me now. Tonight, we follow St. Peter Claver from a Spanish boyhood to the docks of Cartagena, where for years he became the slave of the slaves, living on Eucharistic love, breaking under fatigue, yet never letting the abandoned doubt their dignity. From that narrow village road, the path of his life began to stretch farther than he could yet imagine, and it started in a place so small and quiet that most travelers passed without a thought. Verdú, tucked among the dry hills of Catalonia, was a village of stone houses, olive groves, and patient fields. When Peter Claver was born there in the year 1580, Spain was wrapped in a strong Catholic spirit after the Council of Trent, and even remote towns felt the pull of a faith that shaped festivals, work, and conscience. The bell of the parish church cut through the morning air like a steady heartbeat, calling farmers from their plots, mothers from their kitchens, children from their play, and reminding everyone that life had a center beyond the day's labor. Peter grew up inside that sound, not as someone forced into devotion, but as someone who seemed to breathe it naturally. His family were ordinary people, neither wealthy nor famous, but they carried a quiet dignity and a simple piety. They taught their children to cross themselves before meals, to kneel for evening prayer, to honor the saints who watched over their land, and to trust that God was near even when life was hard. In such a home, the idea of giving oneself to God was not strange or dramatic. It was woven into daily life as plainly as bread and water. Those who knew Peter as a boy did not describe a child eager for attention. If anything, he was remembered for a gentle reserve, for listening more than speaking, for watching the world with a kind of thoughtful gravity. He was not gloomy. There was warmth in him and a steady kindness, but his joy seemed quiet, like a flame sheltered from wind. He would linger inside the church after Mass when other boys hurried outside. The candles and the side altars drew him. The stillness drew him even more. He liked the way the nave felt during the afternoon, when sunlight fell through high windows and dust floated in the beams. In that light, he began to learn a lesson that would follow him all his life, that God often moves most deeply in silence and in things the world overlooks. A village boy sees the same faces every day. He learns early who is strong and who is frail, who is quick to laugh and who carries sorrow. Peter had a natural tenderness for the fragile. He would help an older neighbor lift a burden without being asked. He would sit beside a sick person in a dim room, not knowing what to say, yet somehow making the space less lonely. This was not heroic behavior, only the kind of goodness that grows when a heart is attentive. But there was a steadiness in him that people noticed. He did not do a kind act once and then move on. He returned to it as if he believed love was something you practiced like prayer, daily, without needing reward. The wider world, with its trade routes and wars and distant colonies, drifted into Verdú mostly as stories. Spanish ships sailed to the Americas and back, and from time to time travelers or officials passed through the countryside speaking of riches, of storms, of faraway peoples. Yet for a child in Verdú, these things were shadows at the edge of imagination. What he felt more directly was the moral air of his homeland. Spain in those years was proud of its Catholic identity, fiercely protective of doctrine, and eager for missionaries. The stories of saints who crossed oceans to preach the gospel were told with reverence. the image of the priest who leaves everything for Christ was held in high esteem. Still, Peter did not yet dream of distant lands. His calling was not a sudden vision flaring before him in childhood. It was more like a slow shaping, as if the Lord were patiently carving a vessel for some future mercy. In adolescence, his seriousness did not fade. If anything, it deepened. He was not immune to ordinary restlessness, but he met it by turning toward discipline rather than away from it. He learned to examine his conscience carefully, to confess regularly, to speak with the parish priest about his inner struggles. He began to sense that the Christian life was not only about avoiding sin, but about offering oneself, and that offering must be real, not imaginary. He discovered, in small ways, that prayer is strongest when it costs something, when it is done amid fatigue, distraction, or disappointment. These lessons are easy to miss when we speak about saints, because we prefer dramatic conversions or grand gestures. Yet in Peter's case, the foundations were laid through ordinary fidelity. God, it seems, was teaching him to remain with a task, with a person, with a sorrow, even when the heart wants to flee. That ability to remain would one day carry him into places most people could not endure for an hour. His parents, recognizing both his intelligence and his piety, chose to send him to study in Barcelona. For a village family, this was a sacrifice. It meant money, distance, uncertainty, and the quiet ache of watching a child step out of the familiar world. For Peter, it meant leaving the hills that had shaped his boyhood and entering a city that pulsed with argument, ambition, commerce, and noise. Before he went, he walked the lanes of Verdú with a kind of inward farewell. The fields where he had worked, the church where he had prayed, the neighbors who had known him since infancy, all seemed to press into his memory. He did not cling to them as if he were afraid to leave, but he carried them with gratitude, like a person who already knows that love does not end when you walk away. It simply changes its form. The road to Barcelona was not long compared with the voyages that would later define his life. Yet for a young man who had lived within the boundaries of a village, it felt like stepping into a wider sea. He rode without fanfare, perhaps with a few books, a simple bag, and a heart that had learned to trust. There is a quiet courage in that kind of trust. It is not loud, not defiant, not filled with visions of success. It is the courage of someone who believes God is gentle and therefore safe to follow, even into the unknown. In these early years, nothing yet announces the extremity of what lies ahead. The slave ships, the sick holds, the endless crowds of chained men and women arriving at Cartagena, all that suffering is still hidden beyond the horizon of his imagination. But a mission as heavy as his does not begin with the mission itself. It begins with a soul trained in the hidden places of fidelity. In Verdú, Peter learned to pray without being seen, to serve without being praised, to notice the overlooked, to endure the slow pace of daily duty, and to recognize Christ in faces marked by fatigue or poverty. He did not yet know that those lessons were a preparation for a life poured out in radical mercy. He only knew that love for God was asking him to walk forward, step by step, into a future that belonged to grace. Even then, grace was preparing a heart for a suffering it had not yet seen. The world offered many futures, but his heart kept choosing only one, and so the road that carried Peter into Barcelona became the first real widening of his life. The city at the dawn of the 17th century was a place of salt air and tiled rooftops, of scholars and merchants, of churches that stood like anchors amid narrow streets. For a young man from Verdú, Barcelona could have felt like a storm of voices. The port was busy, the markets loud, and the university halls alive with constant argument. Yet Peter did not arrive as someone eager to be swallowed by the city. He arrived as a pilgrim of sorts, still carrying the quiet of his village inside him. He found lodging that was simple, kept his habits of prayer, and began the long discipline of study, trusting that God works through the mind as surely as through the hands. In the university, he met teachers who expected sharp minds and steady memories. Peter did not possess the kind of brilliance that dazzles a room, but he had something quieter and sometimes rarer: patience for hard study and a conscience that wanted truth more than victory. When debates rose over classical authors or questions of theology, he listened closely, weighing each point before offering his own. His classmates found him calm even when others grew heated, and they began to seek him out for help, trusting the steadiness of his judgment. Yet, for Peter, learning was never simply about climbing toward status. He had no wish to be admired as clever. He wanted knowledge that could be offered back to God, knowledge that would shape him into a servant who could guide souls with clarity. When he studied logic, he also prayed for humility. When he studied Scripture, he asked to be changed by it. He began to see that faith without understanding can become fragile, but understanding without love becomes cold, and he asked God for both. These were also years when the reach of Spain beyond Europe pressed more clearly upon his imagination. Barcelona was a port city, and ships came and went with the tides. Sailors arrived with tales of the Western Ocean, of feverish coasts and glittering cities in the Americas, of peoples newly encountered and too often brutalized. Peter heard such accounts not as entertainment, but as a kind of moral weight. Sometimes he would stand near the docks, not to gawk at cargo, but to watch the faces of men returning from voyages, the way some carried a swagger of profit, and others the tired look of those who had seen too much. He listened to talk of plantations, of gold, of labor bought and sold, and he felt in his chest a slow tightening. He did not yet have the language to name what would later become his mission, but his heart was already registering the wound of the world. If Christ had died for all, then no human being could be treated as a thing, and yet the world seemed full of ways to forget that truth. It was during this period that something quietly decisive happened in him. Like many students, Peter kept a small notebook for reflections, a private place where he tested the movements of his heart. In it, he wrote a line that would later seem like a seed carrying his whole future. He resolved to devote himself to God to the death, and to serve him as a slave. He did not yet know which people he would serve, or where, or in what manner, but the word slave revealed how deeply he had understood the gospel paradox, that true freedom is found in belonging entirely to Christ, and that the Lord himself became the servant of all. For Peter, to be a slave of God meant to be released from the tyranny of self. It meant that his life was no longer his possession. It would be given, used, and even spent, if that was what love required. Barcelona also brought him closer to the society of Jesus. Jesuits were present in the city, known for education and missionary zeal, and Peter watched them with careful admiration. He saw in them a balance of rigorous intellect and practical charity, men who prayed, studied, and then went out to the edges of society without hesitation. Their obedience was not timid. It was daring, because it trusted God more than personal plans. He attended some of their sermons and took part in the spiritual exercises. What he encountered there was not a burst of emotion, but a demanding clarity. The exercises asked him to imagine his life as a choice between two standards, the standard of Christ and the standard of the world, and to choose not once, but again and again, in concrete acts of surrender. He found that the Jesuit way matched what had been forming in him since boyhood, a love for Christ that was practical, disciplined, and ready to go wherever suffering waited. There were evenings when he walked along the stone walls above the harbor at sunset. The masts stood like dark reeds against the orange sky, and the sea shimmered as if holding secrets. He would watch ships readying for the open ocean and feel a quiet ache of longing, as though the Lord were drawing a thread from his soul toward somewhere he could not yet name. Still, he did not force the longing into a plan. He had learned that God's will is not cracked open by impatience. It ripens in silence, like fruit that cannot be pulled early without losing sweetness. So he waited, prayed, studied, and listened. By the time he reached his early 20s, the inner call was no longer only a longing. It had become a steady conviction. In the year 1602, at about 22 years old, he asked to enter the Society of Jesus. The decision cost him something real. It meant leaving the companionship of university peers, giving up the chance of a comfortable profession, and stepping into a rule of life that would test every weakness he carried. It meant more departures from familiar places, and perhaps the quiet sorrow of parents who had already watched him leave once. Yet Peter had come to see that love grows not by clinging, but by offering. He knew that to follow Christ is to be led, not always to where one would choose, but to where one is needed. As he prepared to lay aside the ordinary ambitions of youth, he did not feel himself shrinking into a smaller life. He felt himself entering a larger one, a life whose boundaries would be set not by fear or self-interest, but by the breadth of God's mercy. And even as he stepped toward the Jesuit door, he could not yet see the far shore of his calling, only the next faithful step, and the quiet truth that had guided him so far. The world offered many futures, but his heart kept choosing only one. He stepped into the Jesuit life as into a furnace that purifies quietly, and the threshold he crossed in 1602 did not lead into spectacle, but into the steady grammar of holiness. The novitiate received Peter Claver with a rhythm almost hidden in its simplicity. Rising before dawn, prayer spoken in calm voices, long silences full of listening, practical labor done without fuss, and study that asked the mind to bow before truth rather than parade itself. The house where he began this life was plain, yet there was a sense of deep purpose in its corridors, as though every hour, even the smallest one, belonged to God. For a young man who had carried quiet devotion since boyhood, this was not a sudden change of heart, so much as a sharpening of what had been growing in him for years. Still, the novitiate was a real school, and it tested him as every true school must. In the first seasons of this path, his nature met its real resistance. The body that had once moved freely through village fields and city streets now answered a bell. There were mornings when sleep tugged at him, and the chapel felt cold, afternoons when assigned work seemed small, and evenings when memory opened onto faces he might never see again. Homesickness would rise like a tide, and with it the quiet question of whether he was strong enough for a road so hidden. Yet the novitiate did not treat such motions as failures. It treated them as the raw material of surrender. Peter learned to name restlessness without panic, to bring it into prayer, and to place it in God's hands the way one places a heavy burden down at the feet of Christ. He began to understand that fidelity is not the absence of struggle, but the choice to remain faithful in the middle of it. The center of that shaping was the spiritual exercises. In them, Peter was invited to walk slowly through the life of Jesus, not as a reader at a distance, but as a companion asked to stay close. He lingered over Christ, touching lepers whose skin frightened others, over the way the Lord ate with people the righteous despised, over the calm look Jesus gave the rich young man, loving him while naming the cost of discipleship. He returned often to the washing of feet, that quiet hour when the Master knelt before dusty men who would soon abandon him. The scene did not merely move Peter, it instructed him. If Jesus had taken the lowest place by choice, how could a disciple seek anything higher? If the Lord had entered human misery without flinching, how could a Jesuit refuse the suffering at the margins? Little by little, these prayers were carving a clear path in his heart, a path that pointed not toward comfort or honor, but toward the wounded. Community life shaped him just as deeply. For all its silence, the novitiate was not solitary. Peter lived among men of different ages and temperaments, some quick with words and laughter, others reserved, some bright with confidence, others carrying a shy fragility. Daily frictions became another school. A sharp remark at breakfast, a complaint during work, a clash in study. These were not large storms, yet they revealed how easily self reasserts itself even in a holy place. Peter noticed the impulse to defend himself, to withdraw, or to judge. He also noticed how quickly peace returned when he chose humility instead. He practiced listening when he wanted to answer, yielding when he wanted to win, forgiving before resentment had time to harden. Such choices were small, but they were constant. And in their constancy, they trained him for a mercy that would one day have to be larger than his own feelings. He learned that charity is not a mood, but a habit, and that the truest love is often quiet, patient, and unseen. The Jesuit way also insisted on humble service. Peter was given tasks that looked ordinary from the outside: scrubbing floors, carrying water, helping in the kitchen, tending a sick brother, running errands through town. None of this was meant to humiliate, only to teach the heart where Christ likes to hide. Peter found that these labors did not diminish him, they steadied him. He had long sensed that love is proven by what one does when no one is watching. And here he lived that truth daily. He learned to do a task well without needing to be thanked, to accept correction without becoming wounded, and to remember that the Son of God spent most of his earthly life in work that history never recorded. In the quiet fatigue of these duties, Peter began to see a strange sweetness, as though God were saying that nothing offered in love is wasted, even if it is never seen. Study continued alongside this practical life. Philosophy stretched his reasoning, theology widened his gaze, and his teachers pressed him to be exact. Peter's mind was careful rather than showy. He read slowly to be sure he understood not only the words, but their weight. When he studied grace, he thought of it as the strength that helps a person do what nature alone cannot. When he studied the sacraments, the Eucharist drew him with particular tenderness. In the quiet of Mass, he felt that Christ was not an idea to admire, but a presence to receive, and that every act of service must flow from that altar. The more he learned, the more he prayed, and the more he prayed, the more he desired to be given away for others. From time to time, older Jesuits visited and spoke of missions over the sea. They did not romanticize distant lands. They spoke of fevers, hunger, languages that took years to learn, the loneliness of living far from one's own people, and the stubbornness of hearts that do not change quickly. Yet they also spoke with a quiet brightness about the joy of bringing the gospel where it had not been known, and about the strange intimacy that grows between a missionary and those who suffer. Peter listened in silence, feeling again that tug toward an unknown horizon. He did not yet know where obedience would send him, but he sensed that his life was being prepared for something that would demand not only zeal, but endurance, tenderness, and a kind of fearless nearness to pain. As his early formation unfolded, those around him began to recognize an unusual steadiness. He was not loud in recreation, not quick to claim a point in conversation, but when he spoke, there was gentleness and weight in his words. He could sit beside a troubled brother and offer peace without preaching. He could take unpleasant work without drama. His prayer carried a patient attention that made others feel safe. It was as if the novitiate had not remade him into someone else, but had uncovered what God had planted in him from the beginning. When the time came for his first vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, Peter pronounced them with quiet certainty. Poverty meant trusting God and keeping his hands free for those in need. Chastity meant a heart undivided, capable of belonging widely without grasping. Obedience meant letting God's will arrive through superiors, even when it led into darkness. Kneeling there, he did not feel he was giving up life. He felt he was handing life back to the one who had given it, and stepping onto a road whose end was still hidden, but whose direction was now unmistakably Christ's. Holiness was beginning to feel less like light and more like steady fire. In the hush of Majorca's corridors, Providence placed a guide in his path. And what had been a quiet flame in Peter Claver began to lean toward a particular horizon. After the first years of Jesuit formation, obedience sent him to the island of Majorca, to Palma, where he would continue his studies. The move itself was another gentle uprooting, and Peter was learning that Jesuit life is a series of departures, each one teaching the heart to travel light. Majorca was not an exotic destination, but it had its own calm beauty, with sea breeze threading through courtyards and a kind of slower, sunlit rhythm that softened the edges of labor. The college in Palma held a seriousness of purpose, and Peter entered it as he had entered the novitiate, without noise, ready to be shaped by whatever God placed before him. He gave himself to study, to prayer, and to the quiet discipline of daily life. But in those years, something more happened, something that could not have been planned by teachers or superiors, something that arrived like a gift, meant for a future he still could not see. In the Jesuit residence, there was an old man who served as porter, a brother whose work was humble and unnoticed by most visitors. His name was Alphonsus Rodriguez, and he had lived long enough to be stripped by sorrow and rebuilt by grace. Widowed, having lost children, he had entered the society late in life with a heart made tender by grief. His duties were simple: opening and closing doors, greeting guests, running errands, sweeping and praying. Yet in that very simplicity he had become a kind of hidden well. People came to him not because his role was important in the usual sense, but because his soul was luminous. The porter's chair near the doorway had become a little confessional of its own. Students paused there to ask advice. Priests spoke with him about their burdens. Travelers felt a peace in his presence without knowing why. He did not offer complicated counsel. He listened, smiled, and spoke few words, but those words had the weight of someone who had learned to trust God in darkness. For Peter, meeting Alphonsus was like meeting a quiet mirror of the path he himself was learning to walk. Here was a man who had been crushed by loss, yet had not turned bitter, who lived in obscurity, yet carried a joy that did not depend on praise. Peter's heart leaned toward him naturally. He found reasons to be near the doorway, to exchange small greetings that opened into deeper conversations. In Alphonsus's presence, he learned again that holiness is not always found in grand positions, but often in hidden obedience. The old porter noticed Peter, too. He saw the young Jesuit's seriousness, his reserve, and the way he listened, as if he were already preparing to serve someone unseen. Their friendship grew quietly, the way true friendships in religious life often do, shaped more by shared prayer than by shared leisure. Sometimes they spoke about the saints Peter had loved since childhood, about Francis Xavier and the first Jesuit missionaries who had crossed the sea with nothing but a crucifix and a burning heart. Sometimes they spoke about the interior trials of the spiritual life, about dryness in prayer, about the temptation to grow tired of doing good. Alphonsus spoke always with the calm certainty of someone who had been tested. He told Peter that God sometimes asks a soul not to seek consolation, but to seek fidelity, to keep choosing love even when love feels empty. Peter received this not as a lesson for a season, but as a lesson for a lifetime. Yet the most decisive moment came in a conversation that seemed ordinary at first. Alphonsus, with the kind of gentle authority saints sometimes carry, told Peter that he would go to the Indies, to the New World, and that he would do great service there for God. The words were not spoken as a prediction meant to impress. They were spoken with a quiet simplicity, as though Alphonsus were only repeating something the Lord had already whispered. For Peter, the sentence landed like a bell in a silent church. It did not frighten him. It clarified him. The vague tug toward distant suffering that had visited him in Barcelona now took on a direction. The Indies were not an abstract idea anymore. They were a place the Lord might actually send him, a shore where obedience and mercy would meet. Peter did not respond with excitement or dramatic vows. He carried the words into prayer, letting them settle slowly. He knew that the Jesuit path is not built on private desires, but on discerned obedience. Still, the thought of mission beyond Spain began to shape his imagination in a new way. When he knelt in the chapel, he pictured faces he had never seen. When he read about the gospel going out to all nations, he felt his own life quietly written into that sentence. When he considered the cross, he sensed that following Jesus might soon mean carrying it far from home. Majorca, meanwhile, was not a sanctuary from the world's brokenness. The island was a crossing point for sailors and merchants, and news from across the sea flowed in with ships. Peter heard more about New Granada, about the port of Cartagena, about the vast traffic of enslaved Africans brought across the Atlantic. The reports were not presented as moral outrage. Many spoke of slavery as a matter of trade, an accepted machinery of empire. But Peter, carrying the gospel in his bones, could not hear such things without a quiet grief rising. He had read that Christ came to proclaim liberty to captives. Could a Christian say that with honesty while ignoring those chained in the dark holds of ships? He did not yet know what he would do, but he began to understand what kind of sorrow awaited him if Alphonsus's words were true. And perhaps he began to understand, too, that the Lord sometimes chooses particular souls to stand in the place where others refuse to look. In these Majorca days, Peter's interior life deepened. He practiced the kind of prayer that is less about feeling and more about offering. Sometimes he experienced consolation, a warm sense of God's nearness like sunlight falling on the heart. Sometimes he felt nothing at all, only the slow ache of fatigue and the temptation to ask whether his hidden life mattered. Alphonsus guided him through both seasons. He told him gently that feelings are not the measure of prayer, that a dry offering is often more precious than a sweet one, because it is given without reward. Peter learned to stay at the altar even when nothing stirred in him, to trust that God was working invisibly. That lesson would one day sustain him when the suffering around him was so overwhelming that consolation could not reach him. As months passed, obedience moved him through the ordinary stages of Jesuit schooling. But beneath the surface, he felt a quiet readiness assembling in him, like a ship being prepared at dock. He began to accept more deeply that his life was not meant to be carved into a comfortable place within Spain. It was meant to be poured out. He wrote, prayed, and listened, and in his heart there grew a calm willingness to go wherever he was sent. Not because he was eager for adventure, but because he was eager to belong to Christ in the concrete. The old porter's words did not make him restless. They made him steady. And this steadiness was not his own achievement. It was grace, moving like a slow river inside him, washing away fear, pride, and reluctance until only willingness remained. When the time finally came for superiors to consider assignments beyond Europe, Peter did not need to manufacture zeal. The seed had already been planted, watered by prayer, and confirmed by Alphonsus's quiet counsel. He could look at the sea from Majorca's shore and not feel a romantic pull, but a sober yes. The horizon no longer represented possibility only. It represented responsibility. Somewhere beyond it were people he had not yet met, suffering he had not yet touched, and a Christ waiting in those wounds. Sometimes a saint is born because another saint whispers courage into him, and Peter Claver walked forward from Majorca carrying that whisper like a lantern. The sea carried him to the place where human sorrow waited in chains, and the voyage that began as an act of obedience became, before it ended, a kind of silent surrender. In 1610, when Peter Claver was still a young Jesuit in formation, the order finally sent him across the Atlantic to New Granada. The decision did not come wrapped in drama. It arrived as assignments in religious life often do, through a calm directive from superiors, a brief conversation, a date set for departure, and then the practical preparations of travel. Yet for Peter, the meaning was immense. He remembered Alphonsus Rodriguez's quiet prophecy, and he felt it now turning into flesh and time. He packed few things, because a Jesuit traveling to mission lands was expected to carry little. He brought books needed for study, a crucifix, perhaps a small image of the Virgin, and the habits of prayer that had become his inner home. As the ship pulled away from the European coast, he watched the land thin into a line, then vanish. He did not feel the excitement of adventure. He felt a stillness, almost like a vow renewed in motion. He was leaving behind everything that had given him shape, not because he despised it, but because love was asking him to step outward. The ocean in those days was not a simple passage. It was a long uncertainty. Weeks or months of sailing meant storms that could scatter ships like leaves, sickness that could sweep through cramped quarters, and the constant ache of distance. Peter lived that uncertainty with the quiet discipline he had learned in the novitiate. He rose as early as the ship allowed, prayed in a corner where the air was least stifling, helped where he could, and remained attentive to the men around him. There were sailors whose lives had hardened into rough humor and superstition, and there were passengers carrying quiet fears they did not know how to name. Peter spoke little, but his presence carried a kind of calm that others leaned toward. When seas rose in violent weather and the ship groaned like a living creature, he did not display panic, only a steady trust, as though to say that even here God was not far away. In the long nights, when the vessel was wrapped in darkness and the sea sounded endless, he considered what awaited him in Cartagena. He knew the port as a name, not a reality. He knew it was a gateway of empire, a place where Spanish power met the New World, a place scented with salt and commerce. He had heard that enslaved Africans were brought there in great numbers, and he had heard enough to understand that the trade was cruel. Yet, imagination, no matter how sympathetic, cannot fully prepare the heart for the sight of suffering in the flesh. Peter could only offer himself in advance, asking Christ not to spare him from what he needed to see, but to give him the grace to serve without turning away. When the ship finally approached the coast of South America, the air changed. Heat thickened it. The horizon carried a different color of light, and the smell of land was heavy with vegetation and river water. Cartagena rose ahead, its harbor guarded by fortifications, its streets busy with soldiers, merchants, priests, and the constant movement of goods and people. To Peter's eyes, it was both beautiful and unsettling, like a place whose brightness hid a deep shadow. He stepped onto the dock and felt the weight of the sun, the press of unfamiliar sounds, the swirl of languages, and the shock of a world that did not know him. He was a foreigner now, a stranger in a land that would soon become the only home he needed. His first days were taken up with settling into Jesuit life there, meeting superiors, beginning study in the colleges of the region. Yet Cartagena itself pressed on him almost immediately. Even without seeking them, he encountered the consequences of the slave trade. The city's wealth depended on it. The streets carried a constant flow of enslaved men and women moved as labor, their bodies marked by exhaustion, their eyes often emptied of hope. He saw them hauling burdens under watchful guards, or clustered in courtyards where buyers examined them like livestock. The sight pierced him not with anger alone, but with something colder and deeper. Grief at a sin that had become normal. He had been trained to see Christ in every human person, and here Christ seemed everywhere beaten, sold, and ignored. Peter felt the temptation to despair, the thought that evil was too vast to confront. But the exercises had taught him to look at the cross without fleeing. He understood that despair is another kind of refusal, because it treats suffering as more powerful than grace. So he held his grief in prayer and asked God for the courage to remain near it. A Jesuit's obedience did not allow him to choose his ministry yet. He was still a student, finishing the preparation necessary for priesthood. He was sent away from Cartagena at times to Tunja and Bogota to continue his studies, but the memory of the port followed him like a wound that would not close. Even in quieter towns, he could not forget the faces he had glimpsed. He read theology with those eyes in mind. When he studied moral teaching, he felt its urgency. When he studied Christ's redeeming love, he felt its demand. His prayer began to include not only his own soul, but the countless souls arriving in chains and sickness each week. He did not yet have access to the docks, but he felt his heart walking there in advance, as if compassion were already dragging his feet toward the place his vows would one day set him. He also began to understand that Cartagena was a city of contrasts. There were devout Catholics who attended Mass faithfully and supported religious life, and there were officials whose spirituality remained sealed off from the cruelty that fed their prosperity. There were priests laboring among the poor, and there were traders who treated human lives as numbers. This contradiction did not confuse Peter as much as it saddened him. It showed him how easily faith can become a shell when it is not pierced by mercy. It also showed him that the mission awaiting him would not be simple preaching. It would be the slow work of reawakening dignity where dignity had been crushed, and of insisting, through love, that the gospel is real for the most abandoned. When ships arrived in the harbor, he could see the stir from a distance, the bustle of buyers, the officials charting cargo, the movement of guards driving shackled bodies onto land. Sometimes the wind carried a smell that told him enough. Sweat, sickness, fear. He would stop what he was doing and pray a quick prayer for those unseen people, asking Mary to be near them, asking Christ to hold them in their terror. He had no idea that in years to come, he would be among the first to climb aboard those ships, bringing fruit, water, and medicines into the holds, but something in him already felt bound to them. The port was not merely a place in the city. It was a kind of living crucifix. His health, too, began to feel the toll of this new climate. The heat was relentless. Diseases traveled easily in crowded quarters. For Europeans newly arrived, fever was a common companion. Peter endured early illnesses with patience, and perhaps, in the quiet of weakness, he began to grasp another truth. That mission would not ask only his compassion, but his body. His strength was not his own to keep. It would be spent, broken, and offered as part of the vocation. He did not fear this. He simply accepted it as the shape love takes when it is serious. By the time his first months in New Granada passed, Peter's life had entered a new gravity. The new world had not only widened his horizon, it had changed the center of his heart. He was still a student, still in formation, still living within the careful Jesuit structure of prayer and study, but now the suffering he had once only heard about was real flesh before his eyes. The calling to be a servant of Christ had become the calling to be near the most wounded members of Christ's body. The city offered many paths, some leading toward comfort, influence, or quiet piety. Peter sensed that his path was leading down into something darker, not for the sake of darkness, but for the sake of love. What he saw could not be unseen, and what he felt could not be refused. Though he studied in quiet towns, Cartagena's cries followed him in memory, and the deeper he traveled into his formation, the more those cries seemed to fold themselves into his prayers like a refrain that would not fade. After his arrival in New Granada, obedience drew Peter away from the bustling port and into the inland centers where Jesuit students were trained. Tunja, set high in cooler air, was a town of churches and academies, less feverish than the coast, its streets calmer, its pace measured. Later he would study in Bogotá, where wide plazas and mountain light gave the city a different kind of dignity. These places were not free of poverty or injustice, but they did not carry the same raw spectacle of human misery that he had first encountered on the Cartagena docks. In some ways they provided a mercy, a space where the young Jesuit could strengthen his mind and spirit before the full weight of mission settled on his shoulders. But for Peter, they were not a retreat from the suffering he had seen. They were a workshop where God was quietly shaping his response to it. Each morning in Tunja began, as Jesuit mornings always did, with prayer long before the city stirred. In a chapel still cool and dark, the candle flames small and steady against stone. Peter knelt with his brothers, attentive to the psalms, attentive to the silent presence that filled the room. Yet now, as he prayed, he found his imagination returning again and again to the enslaved men and women he had glimpsed in Cartagena, to the hollow eyes and the bruised wrists, to the way bodies were examined and bargained over. He did not try to force those images away in order to pray more purely. He understood that prayer is not an escape from the world, but a way of carrying the world to God. So he brought those faces into the chapel with him. He asked Christ to be close to them in sickness, to be near them in terror, to keep alive within them the knowledge that they were not forgotten. He asked Mary to cover them with her mantle, because if a mother could not protect them in life, perhaps the Mother of God could hold them in spirit. These petitions were not yet part of a defined ministry. They were the first slow tightening of a vow, the shaping of a heart into a place where others might one day find refuge. His studies in theology pressed him in new ways. He was learning not only about God in the abstract, but about grace as a living force that bends human history back toward mercy. He read of the Incarnation, and it no longer seemed like a doctrine resting on a page. It seemed like the pattern of what he had to live. God had entered the lowest place of human life not choosing the palaces of power, but the stable, the workshop, the dusty roads among the poor. If God had done this, could a servant of God choose comfort as his aim? He read of the sacraments, and the Eucharist shone more brightly than ever. In the bread and wine, he learned that love becomes tangible. Christ does not offer a distant sympathy. He offers himself. Peter felt that if the host was truly Christ-given for the world, then the priesthood awaiting him would have to take the same shape. It would have to be an offering of presence, not merely instruction. He did not yet dare to say that his body would be bread for others, but the thought hovered close, as if grace were preparing him to accept it when the time came. The Jesuit culture around him was disciplined and demanding. His teachers expected precision in argument and comprehension, and his superiors watched not only the progress of his mind, but the steadiness of his character. Peter met these expectations without complaint. He was not the most brilliant in the room, but he was among the most faithful. His notes were careful. His attention was quiet and complete. He had learned in Barcelona that learning without humility becomes vanity, and in the novitiate that learning without love becomes sterile. So in Tunja and Bogotá he tried to hold all three together. He studied, he prayed, and he served his brothers in whatever small tasks were given, remembering that a Jesuit is always being trained, even when the training appears ordinary. If a companion was ill, Peter sat beside him. If work was unpleasant, he took it without drama. If a superior corrected him, he accepted it as one more chisel shaping the stone of his soul. Yet the formation years were not only internal. The region's realities kept pressing their way into the lives of the students. Travelers from the coast arrived with news. Priests passing through spoke of the endless human cargo brought from Africa. Some spoke with sorrow, some with the weary tone of those who had grown accustomed to evil. Peter listened, his face still, but his heart stirred. At times he felt a sharp anger rise, the kind that comes when one sees innocence crushed. He did not let that anger harden into hatred. He placed it before God and asked to be purified. He knew that if he was sent back to Cartagena, he would need not only zeal, but a love that could endure even for those who inflicted suffering. The gospel demanded this impossible thing, and Peter was already learning that what is impossible for nature is possible for grace. He began to practice this love in hidden ways. When he walked through poorer quarters of Tunja or Bogotá, he noticed indigenous people and enslaved Africans doing forced labor, still treated as lesser beings in the colonial order. He would greet them softly, offer small help, listen to their stories through whatever fragments of language he could manage. These encounters were brief, but they formed something essential in him. The habit of approaching the marginalized without fear or superiority. He learned to see not a category, but a person, not a laborer, but a soul. The same quiet impulse that had drawn him to the weak in Verdu now expanded into a deeper pastoral tenderness. It was as though God were teaching him a language of suffering long before he was formally assigned to speak it. In Bogotá, where ecclesial life was stronger and more organized, Peter also witnessed the tension between formal piety and practical mercy. Some people were generous, donating to churches and religious houses, yet remained blind to the cruelty around them. Others carried a humble faith that translated into direct care for the poor. Watching these contrasts, Peter's own vocation clarified further. He understood that holiness is not simply a private ascent toward God. It is the way a heart mirrors God's mercy in the world. A saint is not someone who stands apart from suffering with clean hands. A saint is someone who enters suffering with the hands of Christ. This realization did not make him impatient. It made him ready. He did not press superiors for mission assignments. He simply continued to say yes to each day's obedience, trusting that God would open the next door in His own time. Still, deep within him, a vow was forming, not yet spoken aloud, but already alive. He felt that when he became a priest, his priesthood could not be for a comfortable parish or a quiet classroom alone. It must be for those whom society treated as refuse. He sensed that God was asking him to stand in the breach of a vast injustice, not to solve it by power, which he did not have, but to contradict it by love, which he could offer without limit. There were nights in Bogota when the air cooled and the city grew still, and Peter would sit with his breviary open, pausing over the words, wondering, almost whispering into the dark, "Lord, where are you suffering most, and will you let me go there?" He did not always feel an answer. Often there was only silence, but the silence did not feel empty. It felt like a promise waiting to be unveiled. By the time his theological studies neared completion, the mission was no longer a distant possibility. It had become the inner shape of his desire. Grace was preparing a priest who would not stay safely inside the cloister. The same hands that lifted the host would soon lift broken bodies, and the day of Peter Claver's ordination arrived not like a triumph, but like a quiet seal placed on a life already leaning toward sacrifice. By 1616, he had completed the long Jesuit course of studies, and obedience brought him back to Cartagena, the city that had first wounded him with the sight of human cruelty, and now would become the permanent landscape of his vocation. He returned older than when he first stepped onto its docks, older in soul as much as in years, carrying a theologian's clarity, a novice's discipline, and a heart that had been slowly trained to remain near suffering without turning away. Cartagena greeted him with the same heat, the same crowded streets, the same bustle of empire, and the same shadow cast by the trade that fed its wealth. Yet his return was different now because he came not merely as a student passing through, but as a man approaching the altar, preparing to become a priest of Jesus Christ in a place where Christ was daily crucified in the bodies of the enslaved. The days leading to ordination were filled with the ordinary steps of preparation: retreats, examinations, confessions, prayers spoken with a gravity that made him feel both small and strangely free. In those hours he did not ask God for an easy ministry. He asked only to be made faithful. He knew his limits. He knew his body was not strong by nature, that he had already felt illness in this climate, and that the work his heart was drawn toward would cost him more than he could imagine. Still, he felt no impulse to bargain. A priest is not ordained to protect himself. He is ordained to belong to Christ for others, and Peter understood that belonging with a kind of sober joy. On the morning of ordination, the cathedral stones held the coolness of night, but the air outside was already warming under the rising sun. Peter walked with other candidates through the familiar ritual, yet he felt as if each step carried a quiet finality. When he lay prostrate during the litany of the saints, his face pressed to the floor, he felt the whole communion of heaven leaning close. The names of saints washed over him like a gentle river, and among them he heard, in a deeper place of his heart, the names of the poor and enslaved for whom he longed to be a servant. He was not thinking of himself then, not of future reputation or achievement. He was simply offering the bare truth of his life, asking to be used. When the bishop's hands rested on his head and the prayer of consecration was spoken, Peter felt the moment not as an emotional surge, but as a quiet flood of reality. He was now forever configured to Christ the priest, Christ the victim, Christ the shepherd. His life was no longer his own in any partial way. And if that was true, then every suffering human being in Cartagena was now part of his responsibility. His first Mass followed soon after, and it remained in his soul like a small, bright wound. At the altar he lifted the bread and wine, and he knew, with a certainty that startled him with its simplicity, that the Eucharist was not only food for the faithful, it was the shape of love itself. Christ did not remain distant from human misery. He entered it. He allowed himself to be broken, and he stays with his people in a form that can be received by the hungry. Peter's eyes lingered on the host longer than the ritual required, not out of piety meant to be seen, but because his heart was grasping something essential. If he was to be a priest in this place, he had to become Eucharistic himself. He had to be willing to be given, to be broken, to be consumed by love for those who had no one else. After Mass, he stayed in the quiet church for a while, letting the silence soak into him. He did not foresee the precise details of the years ahead, but he sensed their general contour. The dockside, the fetid holds of ships, the sick who would need tending, the dying who would need baptism, the despised who would need to hear that they were beloved. He did not romanticize any of this. The smell of the port was already in his memory. The city's cruelty was already familiar. Yet he felt no recoil. He felt a deep, steady yes. Almost immediately, the work that had haunted his prayer began to move from longing into action. Cartagena was a major entry point for enslaved Africans into the Spanish Americas, and the rhythm of the city was marked by ships arriving with human cargo. Priests had duties in parishes and schools, and Jesuits were often assigned to preaching among Spaniards and to education. Peter accepted these tasks, too, because obedience was still his compass. But his superiors saw clearly what had been shaping in him for years, and they began to allow him more direct contact with the enslaved. He met, early in his priesthood, Father Alonso Sandoval, an older Jesuit who already labored among the Africans with extraordinary dedication. Sandoval had been studying their languages, catechizing them patiently, and documenting the horrors of the trade with a clarity that few wanted to read. In him, Peter found not only a mentor, but a living confirmation of his own desire. Sandoval taught him practical things: how to use interpreters, which medicines to carry, how to recognize the kinds of sickness most common among those torn from ships, how to proclaim the gospel in a way that did not crush already crushed spirits. But beyond these techniques, Sandoval taught him something more essential by example: that to serve the enslaved was to accept misunderstanding, ridicule, and exhaustion as part of the offering. Peter watched Sandoval return from the docks with clothes stained, body weary, eyes both grieving and alive. He understood that this was not a side ministry. It was a way of carrying Christ into the very center of a human nightmare. As a newly ordained priest, Peter's first visits to the slave barracks and shipyards were not grand gestures. They were hesitant, reverent steps into a suffering he still had to learn to bear. He went with small supplies, with bread and fruit, with a few bandages, with water, and with a tenderness that had matured in prayer. The first time he entered a holding place where newly arrived Africans were kept, the air struck him like a wall. Bodies pressed together in cramped darkness, many too weak to stand, some delirious in fever, some staring in shocked silence, some crying out in languages he did not understand. The smell of sweat, sickness, and fear was thick enough to taste. Peter felt a momentary dizziness, not from weakness only, but from the sheer immensity of sorrow gathered in one room. He steadied himself by doing what grace had trained him to do. He remained. He knelt beside the nearest person, offered water, touched a shoulder gently, and through an interpreter said the simplest truths he could speak. You are not alone, you are loved, you are God's child. The words may have landed only partly in minds still shattered by trauma, yet Peter knew love is not wasted simply because it cannot be fully received at once. It is planted, and God grants growth in time. With each visit, his pastoral instinct sharpened. He began to learn that many of these men and women had never heard the name of Christ, or had heard it only through the cruelty of those who claimed to be Christian. He realized that before he could teach doctrine, he had to restore trust. He had to show, by presence and gentleness, that faith was not another chain, but a doorway into dignity. His priesthood, at its root, became an act of companionship. He could not free them from slavery by force. He had no political power, no weapons, no voice in the machinery of empire, but he could free something inward, the belief that they were worthless. He could contradict the lie written on their bodies by the truth of the gospel written into their souls. And he could do this not once, but again and again, in small, steady acts that answered despair with love. The city watched him with mixed reactions. Some Spaniards considered his visits admirable, even noble, because they were still close enough to be exotic charity. Others felt his work was disturbing, because it forced them to look at what they preferred to ignore. Even within his own community, not everyone understood the necessity of this mission. Yet Peter was still early in the road. The deeper opposition, the heavier cost, the long physical attrition had not yet fully arrived. For now there was only the first flowering of priestly love, the slow widening of his heart into its true field. His hands had been consecrated at the altar, and they were already finding their place among the wounded. The altar became the wellspring of everything he would endure. Under Sandoval's gaze, Peter's compassion found a clear road, and what had been a vow forming in silence now took on a name he would carry like a brand upon his soul. Cartagena in these years was a city that lived with 1 foot in the church and 1 foot in the marketplace of human bodies. The harbor was never quiet for long. Slave ships came in with the seasons, their sails appearing on the horizon like omens, and each arrival sent a ripple through the streets. Officials gathering papers, buyers readying money, guards preparing chains, and the Jesuits quietly collecting food, fruit, medicines, and small comforts that could be carried into the holds. Father Alonso Sandoval had already made this work his life. For him, to preach Christ among the enslaved was both a command of the gospel and a direct contradiction of the city's moral blindness. He had spent years learning the patterns of the trade, the languages of the Africans brought from many regions, and the practical steps needed to bring some measure of dignity into a place built on humiliation. He had also learned, the hard way, that this ministry required an unbreakable patience. The enslaved arrived shattered in body and spirit, terrified, suspicious, often unable to believe that any white man could come near them without harm. To teach them faith required first healing the wound of trust, and that wound could not be rushed. Peter watched Sandoval move among the newly arrived with the calm tenderness of someone who had chosen a lifelong sorrow and found Christ inside it. He saw him kneel beside a fevered man without hesitation, hands steady as he lifted a cup of water to cracked lips. He saw him lean close to a woman who could not stand, listening through an interpreter with a face that carried no disgust, only attention. He saw him preach not with thunder, but with simple, repeated truths. That God had not abandoned them, that Christ had suffered as they suffered, that the church was not a house of Spaniards only, but a home meant for every nation under heaven. Sandoval did not speak of this as a theory. He lived it, and Peter felt his own heart recognizing its future in every gesture. At first he joined Sandoval as a helper, carrying baskets, offering bandages, learning to read the particular needs of each arrival. He learned which foods could be swallowed by those who had not eaten in days. He learned how to wash sores without causing more pain. He learned to move slowly in crowded darkness so that fear would not rise unnecessarily. He learned to keep his face gentle even when his stomach turned at the smell of sickness and the sight of bodies stacked like discarded wood. In those early dockside hours, he discovered that compassion is not only a feeling. It is a skill that must be practiced in the presence of horror so that love does not collapse into helplessness. Sandoval was not only teaching him to serve, he was teaching him to endure. Yet while Sandoval guided him with wisdom, he did not keep Peter under his shadow. He recognized the younger priest's unusual steadiness, and he understood that God was planting in him a kind of mercy that needed room to grow. So Sandoval entrusted him with more responsibility. Peter began to lead visits, to coordinate interpreters, to prepare catechesis in a way that could be understood by people torn from entirely different worlds. He spent hours with the interpreters themselves, asking them to help him learn basic phrases in several African languages, not to become fluent, which was nearly impossible given the diversity of those arriving, but to let people hear a greeting, a reassurance, a blessing in sounds that felt like home. The effort mattered more than the perfection. A man who tries to meet you in your language is already telling you that you are worth the trouble. Slowly, Peter also learned to see the enslaved not only as victims, but as persons with their own histories, fears, and strengths. Some were young and bewildered, some older, with the grave dignity of those who had lived full lives before being stolen. Some were fierce in their resistance, some numb in shock, some already fading toward death. He learned to approach each soul differently, to offer comfort to the broken without patronizing, to offer firmness to the fearful without pressuring. He began to understand, in a pastoral way that no book could teach, that holiness is never a single method. It is love attentive to the person before you. The city's rhythm forced the work to be relentless. When ships arrived, there was no waiting for convenient hours. Peter had to go quickly, because disease spread fast and despair spread faster. He often climbed aboard before the official unloading, pushing through guards with permission Sandoval had earned over years, descending into holds where light was scarce and air almost unbreathable. There, among bodies covered in sores and filth, he would begin the first act of mercy: water, fruit, bread, and a touch that said without words, "You are not an animal." From the ships he followed them to the barracks, then to the marketplaces, then to the plantations where they were sold. Sometimes, to reach those already purchased, he walked miles under heat that punished the lungs, because he could not bear the thought that their first months in a strange land would be without anyone reminding them they were still human in God's eyes. Many nights he returned to the Jesuit house exhausted beyond speech, clothes stained, skin stung by insects, mind filled with faces. He washed, prayed, and slept, then began again. His body, never robust, started to absorb the cost. Yet even in fatigue, his interior life seemed to deepen rather than fray. The Eucharist remained his center. He would rise early for Mass, and there, in the quiet breath of dawn, he offered the day's labor before it began. He felt, with increasing clarity, that to remain faithful in this mission he needed a name for his belonging, a way to bind himself so tightly to the suffering poor that he could not drift away when exhaustion tempted him. This inner movement grew over months and years until it asked for a decisive act. In 1622, At the time he pronounced his final Jesuit vows, he wrote beneath his signature a line that has echoed through centuries. He called himself the slave of the slaves forever. He did not choose the words lightly. He knew slavery in Cartagena was not a metaphor, but a brutal reality. To take that word for himself was to place his life publicly in contradiction to the trade. It was to say that if the world insisted on owning these people, then he would insist on belonging to them in love. His vow did not mean he accepted slavery as right. It meant he refused to let the enslaved be alone inside it. He would not be their master. He would be their servant, as Christ had been servant to all. His fellow Jesuits read the line, and some admired its courage. Others felt uneasy, sensing the radical claim it implied. Peter cared little for either reaction. The vow was not for effect. It was a quiet chain he put around his own heart, a chain of mercy meant to last until death. After that vow, his ministry widened with a new boldness. The ships were no longer only occasions of charity. They were the primary field of his priesthood. He began to prepare supplies in advance, to train helpers, to keep a list of interpreters who could be called at any hour. He also began to see that baptism, while precious, could not be rushed crudely. He wanted the enslaved to understand that the sacrament was not another transaction forced upon them. So he taught with patience, repeating simple truths, using images and gestures as much as words. He baptized thousands over the decades, but each baptism was offered as a doorway into belonging, not as a tally for heaven. When someone was too sick to grasp instruction, he baptized with tenderness anyway, trusting that God's mercy reaches where human comprehension cannot. When someone resisted, he waited, choosing to honor their freedom even in the midst of their captivity. That respect itself was part of his witness. In these years, Peter's identity settled into its final shape. He was a priest, yes, and a Jesuit, yes, but above all, he was a man who had allowed love to claim him so completely that he no longer measured his life by ordinary standards. The vow he wrote in 1622 would become both his consolation and his cross. It would open him to joys the world could not imagine, and to weariness the world would not notice. But in that moment, as he placed his name beneath those words, he felt only the calm clarity of grace. A name written in humility can become a destiny. Every ship was a new Calvary, and he walked toward it again, not because he was made of iron, but because he had learned to find Christ precisely where human misery was thickest. The harbor of Cartagena had its own cruel liturgy. At certain seasons, sails appeared on the horizon like dark birds, and within hours the city stirred with the heavy knowledge of what had arrived. These were not merchant vessels bringing spices or cloth. They were floating prisons, crossing an ocean of death, carrying men, women, and children torn from Africa, chained and stacked in holds where air was scarce and fear was constant. Peter Claver had vowed to belong to these people forever, and so when word came that a ship was in sight, he treated it as an urgent summons. He gathered what he could: baskets of oranges and lemons to fight scurvy, bread softened in water for throats too raw to swallow, jugs of fresh water, cloth for bandages, simple medicines, sometimes tobacco to ease nausea, and small devotional images that could be pressed into hands as quiet signs of tenderness. He called interpreters in haste, men who knew at least fragments of the languages spoken by those arriving. Then he went down to the docks with the hurried calm of someone who knows that every minute matters. When he first climbed aboard a newly arrived ship, the shock never fully went away. It could not, if his heart remained alive. The stench struck him before he reached the hatch, a thick mingling of sweat, vomit, blood, waste, and sickness that clung to the wood itself. Heat gathered below deck, breathing like a fever. As he descended the ladder into the hold, light fell away, and what met his eyes was not a crowd, but a field of human wreckage. Bodies lay pressed against one another in spaces no larger than graves. Some were too weak to lift their heads. Some were delirious, murmuring in broken rhythms. Others stared in silence, eyes wide with the stunned emptiness of those who have crossed a threshold beyond ordinary terror. Chains bit into ankles and wrists. Skin was marked by sores from iron and by bruises from beatings. Children were wedged between adults like fragile branches caught in floodwaters. There were people who had been dead for days, left in place because there was nowhere else to put them during the crossing. Peter would feel his stomach turn and his throat tighten, not from disgust alone, but from grief so sharp it was almost physical. Yet he did not retreat. He had promised not to. He moved slowly at first, because sudden gestures could spark panic. Many of those in the hold had learned to fear the approach of any white man. They had been beaten by sailors, mocked by traders, and treated as cargo without pity. Peter knew his words could not reach them before his presence did. So he knelt. He offered water with his own hands. He peeled fruit and placed it into palms that trembled with weakness. He spoke softly through interpreters, and when interpreters failed because languages were too many, he relied on the language he trusted most. A gentle touch on a shoulder, a hand held over a forehead burning with fever, a steady gaze that did not look away. He made the sign of the cross slowly, letting the gesture be seen, not as a threat, but as a blessing. Sometimes he sang a simple hymn under his breath, not for performance, but because singing kept his heart from hardening. And everywhere he went, he repeated the same truth in every possible form. You are not alone. You are loved. You matter to God. The work on a ship was not a single act, but a sequence of mercies. First came the emergency of thirst and starvation. Some had consumed nothing but moldy rations for weeks. Some had been denied water as punishment. Peter learned to feed them gently, because after long deprivation, the body can reject food. He watched for those near death, touching their wrists to feel pulse, leaning close to listen for breath. If someone was dying and wanted baptism, he gave it quickly, using water from his own jug, whispering the simple formula while the interpreter tried to steady the person's mind. If someone was dying and could not understand him, he baptized anyway when Sandoval had taught him there was reasonable hope of consent, trusting that God's mercy meets a soul even in darkness. These baptisms were not tallies to satisfy a spiritual ledger. They were acts of belonging, saying to a dying person who had been stripped of everything, "You will not die without a name in Christ." Then came the slow work of tending wounds and sickness. Many arrived with dysentery, smallpox, measles, fevers, or infections from lashings. Peter washed sores with vinegar or water, applied cloths, offered simple medicines he carried. He could not cure most of what he saw. The diseases were too advanced, the bodies too weakened. But he knew that care is not measured only by outcomes. To wash someone's ulcered leg without flinching is already to restore a piece of human dignity. To wipe vomit from a face that has been spat on by sailors is already to say with the body what words cannot carry. You are not disgusting. You are a person. You deserve tenderness. Over the years, people would remember him not chiefly for sermons, but for this nearness, this refusal to recoil. Often the ships were met not only by priests but by traders impatient to claim their purchase. The hatch would stay open only a short time before officials demanded order. Peter had to work quickly, and he learned to carry mercy like a person carrying fire through wind. He would press supplies into the hands of those strong enough to pass them along. He would send interpreters to comfort groups while he moved to the sickest. He made sure women were not ignored in the chaos, because they often hid their pain more quietly. He tried to locate children separated from mothers. He could not undo the dismemberment of families, but he could bear witness to the fact that such separation was a wound God saw. Sometimes guards mocked him. Sometimes sailors laughed at his stained clothes and called him foolish for wasting effort on people they considered already ruined. Sometimes traders shouted that he was delaying business. Peter did not argue. He kept working. He had learned that love does not need permission from cruelty. There were days that stayed with him for years, because the suffering was so concentrated, it felt like the air itself had turned to ash. A ship might arrive after a particularly brutal crossing, with half its human cargo dead or dying. In such moments, Peter felt the weight of helplessness press hard. He was one man. He had two hands, a limited basket of supplies, a body already exhausted. Yet somehow, in that very helplessness, his faith sharpened. He would kneel in the middle of the hold and pray under his breath. Not a long prayer, only the kind that rises when words are too slow. Lord, be here. Be in these wounds. Do not let me abandon you in them. Then he would stand and continue, letting grace supply what nature lacked. A strange thing happened in those extremities. His compassion did not become less, it became steadier. The first shock remained, but it no longer paralyzed. It drove him. He began to understand that being the slave of the slaves did not mean he had to feel endlessly dramatic sorrow. It meant he had to be present endlessly, whether sorrow was sharp or numb, whether the day felt victorious or wasted. Mercy was his obedience, and so he practiced it the way one practices breathing. When the enslaved were finally brought off the ships, the ordeal did not end. They were herded into barracks where many collapsed in new fevers. Peter followed them there, bringing more water, cleaning the space as best he could, and continuing catechesis in small fragments. But it was on the ships that his mission was most nakedly revealed. Every arrival confronted him with the same question the gospel had once asked him in the exercises. Will you stay with the suffering Christ? Or will you pass by on the other side? He kept choosing to stay. His body was absorbing the cost, his clothes permanently stained, his hands often trembling with fatigue, but his heart was becoming a shelter for those who had none. And if he could not give them freedom in this world, he could give them a truth no chain could silence. He did not save them from chains, but he refused to let chains define them. After the horror of the docks came the patient work of planting hope, and Peter Claver learned that mercy is not only a rescue in the moment of arrival, but a slow companionship that helps a shattered soul remember how to live. Once the enslaved were dragged from the ships and pushed into Cartagena's barracks and marketplaces, the city's machinery moved quickly to turn them into labor. Bodies were washed, sometimes roughly, sores hidden where possible, and buyers arrived to inspect muscle and teeth with the cold appraisal used for cattle. Families who had survived the crossing together were often separated in a matter of hours. Some were sold to city households, some to distant plantations, some to mines where the air itself could kill. For many, this second stage of captivity was even more bewildering than the first. The sea voyage had been terror without understanding, but here on land they realized that terror had a destination. Peter understood that if he vanished after the ship visits, the gospel he offered would feel like a brief kindness in a world that remained merciless. so he stayed near them as long as he could. He entered the barracks repeatedly, returning with supplies, with interpreters, with a quiet tenderness that began to feel familiar to the newly arrived. He knew that evangelizing people who had been dehumanized required something deeper than lessons. It required restoring the very idea that they were worth being taught at all. The Jesuit house became, in a way, a small armory of compassion. Peter collected food and cloth through donations, begged quietly from those willing to give, and stored medicines for the constant fevers that followed the ships. He did not plan his days by a comfortable schedule. The harbor's rhythm decided for him, yet in the spaces between arrivals, he used every hour to do what he considered the second half of his priesthood, to bring the enslaved into a sense of spiritual belonging. Many of them had never heard the Christian story. Others had heard fragments through Portuguese or Spanish traders, often mixed with threats or ridicule. To them, Christianity could look like the religion of captors. Peter knew that before he could speak of doctrine, he had to embody the opposite of what they had experienced. He had to show, by the way he approached them, that Christ is not the God of chains, but the God who enters chains to break what is deepest in them. He learned to smile gently, to kneel so that his eyes were not looming above theirs, to wait for fear to quiet before teaching anything. Sometimes he passed through a barrack and said nothing at all, simply offering fruit, washing wounds, letting the oppressed see a priest who did not shame them. He understood that trust is its own catechism. When words did come, they came slowly and simply. Through interpreters, Peter began with truths that were more like shelter than argument. He told them that God had made them with love, that their worth did not depend on what any man claimed to own, that Christ had a body that suffered as theirs suffered, and that the church was meant to be a home for every nation. He avoided anything that would sound like a demand or a bargain. He did not speak first of rules. He spoke of belonging. He used images that could cross cultures. The father who sees his children, the shepherd who searches for the lost, the mother who stands beneath the cross, the Savior whose hands are wounded like theirs. When he spoke of Jesus, he lingered on his compassion, on his nearness to the despised, on the way he looked at the poor without contempt. He wanted them to feel that the gospel was not another burden placed upon them, but a truth that could breathe inside them even in captivity. Often he repeated the same lesson many times because trauma makes memory fragile. He did not grow impatient. Repetition, to him, was part of love. He also knew that the enslaved arriving in Cartagena came from many regions of Africa, with different languages, customs, and spiritual backgrounds. An interpreter who understood one group might be useless to another. Peter therefore learned to teach with his hands as much as with his mouth. He used gestures, signs, basic drawings in the dust, small dramas of the gospel acted out quietly so that meaning could land without many words. The sign of the cross became for him a kind of universal grammar. He traced it slowly over each forehead, explaining through whatever language could reach that this was not a brand of ownership, but a mark of being held by God. He held up a crucifix and let them touch it, letting them feel the carved wounds, because he sensed that touch could say more than an explanation. He would point to his own chest, then to heaven, then to theirs, showing that the same God who dwelled above also dwelled within. In a world that had treated them as objects, he kept insisting, in 100 gentle ways, that they were subjects of divine love. Baptism, therefore, became the fruit of a slow road, rather than a quick tally. Peter was renowned for baptizing thousands, But he never treated the sacrament lightly. He wanted as much as possible for people to understand that baptism was a new family, a new name, a new belonging that no master could steal. So he asked simple questions through interpreters. Do you wish to know this God who loves you? Do you desire to be part of his people? He listened for whatever form of consent was possible in such circumstances. When someone said yes, even timidly, he baptized with joy that remained quiet but real. He poured water over the head, pronounced the name of the Trinity, and then lifted the person's face as if to say, "You have been received." Sometimes he gave them a small medal or a scrap of cloth with an image of Mary, not as magic, but as a tangible sign that they were not forgotten. When someone was too sick to speak, he looked into their eyes, read the longing or the openness there, and entrusted the rest to God. And when someone resisted, not wanting anything associated with their captors, he did not force. He waited, sometimes returning days later, offering care without demands, until fear softened into trust. He had learned that grace is patient, and he wanted his ministry to mirror it. Beyond the newly arrived, Peter also sought out the enslaved already living in the city and on its outskirts. He walked to plantations and back alley quarters where Africans labored to exhaustion. He brought confession to those who had been baptized earlier. He offered Mass where possible. He blessed marriages conducted in hidden joy. He baptized children born into slavery so that their first identity would not be their chains. He taught them prayers they could say while working. A Hail Mary murmured under breath. A Jesus prayer repeated like a heartbeat. A simple offering of their suffering united to Christ. He wanted faith to become something they carried in their bodies, not merely in memory. He showed them how to find Christ in small acts of endurance, so that even the hardest days could hold a secret dignity. When someone died, he prayed beside them with the tenderness of a brother, not as an official performing a rite. He made sure the dead were not discarded spiritually, as they had been discarded socially. In that way, he built a hidden church among the enslaved, a community whose walls were not stone, but mutual hope. This work began to change the emotional landscape of Cartagena in subtle ways. The enslaved started to look for him when ships arrived, whispering his name to one another as the priest who came with water and gentleness. They trusted him enough to tell him where the sick were hidden, where families had been separated, where a dying person wanted baptism or simply a hand to hold. He became, for them, a sign that the church could be a refuge rather than a weapon. And something else happened, too. Spaniards who watched his ministry could not always dismiss it. Some were moved to donate supplies. Some began to confess their complicity, or at least to soften toward those they owned. Not all changed, far from it, but Peter's quiet persistence kept pricking the city's conscience. He was not a political reformer in the modern sense. He did not write manifestos or lead rebellions. Yet by treating the enslaved as full persons, he was already undermining the spiritual lie that slavery depended on. He was saying, with every baptism, every bandage, every prayer taught in a dark barrack, that these men and women were members of Christ's body, and therefore the city's cruelty could never be the final word. Still, the work remained heartbreaking. There were days he arrived too late to prevent a death. There were nights he lay awake remembering a child taken from a mother's arms and sold away. There were moments when he felt the weight of how little he could change in structures of power. Yet he had learned to measure his life not by visible victory, but by fidelity. He could not free bodies, but he could defend souls against despair. He could not stop the ships, but he could meet each ship with a love that insisted on dignity. In that insistence, hope grew quietly, like a candle in a cellar. In the kingdom of God, no one is cargo. Holiness rarely looks heroic up close. Often it looks like being misunderstood. And Peter Claver's mercy, so steady among the enslaved, began to draw not only gratitude, but a quiet storm of opposition from the world around him. Cartagena's economy was braided tightly with the slave trade, and any ministry that treated the enslaved as fully human threatened, at least in conscience, the city's comfortable habits. At first, some slave traders tolerated Peter's visits because they saw them as harmless piety, a priest doing what priests do, perhaps even helping keep their newly purchased laborers alive. But as the years passed and Peter's devotion became unmistakably radical, the tone shifted. Traders began to feel that his presence on ships and in barracks carried a judgment, not spoken in insults, but made visible in contrast. Where they saw cargo, he saw souls. Where they moved quickly to profit, he moved quickly to comfort. Where they spoke of Africans as beasts or tools, he spoke of them as brothers and sisters in Christ. Even a silent contradiction can provoke anger. Some traders mocked him openly on the docks, calling him naive, calling him a fool who wasted time on those who would never be truly Christian, those who, in their cruel imagination, did not deserve the effort. The mockery was sharp because it was surrounded by laughter. Peter would walk past men who lifted their hands in exaggerated blessings, taunting his piety, or who spat near his feet as a warning. He rarely answered. He had learned that the gospel is not defended by returning contempt with contempt. It is defended by continuing to love. Yet he felt the wound of it, not because his pride was injured, but because it revealed how hard hearts can become when profit is at stake. There were also moments of real danger. A handful of traders threatened him directly, especially when he tried to delay an unloading in order to reach the dying, or when his insistence on humane treatment disrupted their timetable. Some warned him that he was interfering with business. Others implied he could meet an accident if he kept entering ships without waiting for official permission. Cartagena was not a place where a priest could rely on law to protect him. The trade was backed by power, and power does not like to be disturbed. Peter knew this. The knowledge did not make him reckless, but it made him plain. He did not seek confrontation, yet he refused to retreat. If a ship arrived at night, he went at night. If a guard tried to bar him, he calmly appealed to the authority he had been granted and kept moving. If someone shouted at him, he simply bent lower over the sick. The courage here was not dramatic. It was the daily courage of someone who has decided that the suffering Christ is more real than any threat. Opposition also rose from another side, softer in tone, but painful in its own way. Not everyone in Cartagena's Spanish society admired his ministry. Some wealthy Catholics considered his work distasteful. They liked the idea of charity from a distance, but not the smell of it, not the sight of it up close. Peter returned from ships with clothing stained, skin carrying the odor of the holds, hands marked by sores he had cleaned. When he entered certain homes to beg supplies, some people received him with tight smiles and quickly turned away. Others gave reluctantly, as if helping the enslaved were a tiresome duty rather than a Christian joy. A few complained that he was exaggerating the suffering, that Africans were naturally hardy, that slavery was an accepted part of empire, and therefore not a scandal worth dwelling on. Peter listened to such comments with a kind of weary sorrow. He could not argue the city into repentance. All he could do was continue to live a different truth. Most quietly painful, though, was the resistance he encountered within his own religious community. The Jesuit house in Cartagena was filled with men devoted to God, many generous and holy in their own ways. Yet communities are made of human beings, and human beings do not always understand the particular path of another soul. Some brothers admired Peter, but kept their admiration at a safe distance. Others felt irritated by the disruption his work caused. When a ship arrived, daily schedules bent around it. Interpreters had to be summoned, supplies gathered, rooms rearranged to care for those brought in. The house sometimes filled with sick, enslaved people Peter could not bear to leave in the barracks. Their fevers spread anxiety. Their presence challenged comfort. A few Jesuits murmured that his zeal was excessive, that it drew attention away from the educational and pastoral work they considered more proper. Some resented the way the city spoke of Peter as a saintly figure, while their own labors remained unseen. Others simply recoiled from the physical reality of his ministry. The smell he carried after hours in the holds was hard for them. The risk of contagion frightened them. They did not say these things loudly, but Peter heard them in small comments, in the careful way some avoided his room, in the sighs when he asked for help. He did not judge them harshly. He knew fear and fatigue in his own heart. Still, their distance became a loneliness he could not ignore. Loneliness is a strange companion in an active life. Peter was surrounded by people all day long, by the enslaved whose cries filled his hours, by interpreters, by guards, by traders, by townsfolk who came to confession. Yet at night, when he returned to the Jesuit house, exhausted, he could feel how little his deepest vocation was shared. He had friends, yes, and Sandoval remained a steady ally, but the particular cross of his mission was often carried alone. There were times he sat in the chapel after Compline, the lamps low, the air still, and felt the weight of being misunderstood even by those who loved God. He did not spin this into bitterness. He carried it to Christ. Jesus had also been misunderstood by his own, had eaten alone in a world that needed him, had been abandoned by friends in Gethsemane. Peter found, in that knowledge, a quiet companionship. If he was alone in one sense, he was never alone in the deepest sense. The Eucharist remained his anchor. He would kneel before the tabernacle and speak to Christ with the blunt simplicity of the weary. Lord, you know what I serve. You know why I cannot stop. Keep me gentle. Keep me faithful. Help me love even those who do not understand. Then he would rise, knowing that obedience did not depend on approval. The enslaved themselves became, paradoxically, his consolation. Many began to call him Father with a tenderness that held no irony. They smiled when he arrived, even in the barracks, because his presence meant water, medicine, and a voice that said their lives were not worthless. Some, once baptized and steadied, began to help him serve new arrivals, passing fruit through crowded holds, translating where they could, guiding him toward the sickest corners. In their faces, Peter tasted the quiet joy of his vocation. He saw that love, even when it cannot change the structures of injustice, can still change the interior world of a person. It can keep hope alive. It can keep the soul from collapsing into despair. That was enough to sustain him when opposition grew heavy. Public misunderstanding and private loneliness also refined his spiritual humility. Peter did not begin to think of himself as a hero. If anything, the more resistance he met, the more he felt his own smallness. He knew he was not saving the world. He was only trying to be faithful in his little corner of it. His vow to be the slave of the slaves forever did not mean he expected visible triumph. It meant he accepted a road where success would often look like simply showing up again. In that acceptance, he grew freer. Praise no longer tempted him, because he rarely received it. Criticism no longer paralyzed him, because he had learned to measure his life by Christ's gaze, not by Cartagena's. Still, there were days when the opposition cut deeper than usual. A trader might shove him aside on a ship. A city official might mock the priest of the blacks in public. A Jesuit brother might snap in fatigue at the extra work Peter asked. In such moments he felt the human sting, and he would retreat inward for a second, as any person would. Then he would return to the simple act that defined him, kneeling beside the suffering and continuing to love. He learned that love is most costly when no one applauds it, and he kept paying that cost quietly, trusting that God saw what the world did not. Years passed, not in chapters, but in footsteps from dock to infirmary, and by the time Peter Claver had been serving for 2 decades, the city could no longer separate his mission from the slow unraveling of his body. What had begun as a young priest's ardent offering had become a lifetime rhythm in which every season brought the same summons. A ship on the horizon, the rush to gather supplies, the descent into the holds, the long hours in barracks, the miles walked to plantations, the confessions heard in cramped courtyards, the baptisms whispered over dying lips, the quiet prayers taught to those who labored under a sun that felt merciless. In the first years he had felt exhaustion as something to overcome, a fatigue that would pass with a night's sleep or a short retreat to the chapel. But now exhaustion was no longer a visitor. It was a companion that sat beside him daily, shaping the very way he moved. He learned to accept that his strength would never return to what it had been, and that his vocation was not a sprint, but an attrition of love. The climate itself was a constant trial. Cartagena's heat pressed down like a hand, and tropical illnesses stalked the city. The ships carried not only human cargo, but contagion. Dysentery, smallpox, measles, fevers of every kind traveled in the same holds that carried bodies. Peter almost never entered a newly arrived ship without exposing himself to disease. He did not take foolish risks, but he knew that if he waited for perfect safety, he would never go at all. So he went, again and again, and his body absorbed the cost. There were bouts of fever that left him trembling for days. There were infections he treated in others that flared in his own skin. There were seasons when he could barely swallow because his throat was raw from constant sick air. His lungs tightened in the damp heat. His joints ached from miles walked on hard ground. He sometimes returned to the Jesuit house with dizziness so heavy he had to lean against a wall to keep standing. Yet even then, he did not think of stopping. The most astonishing thing about his endurance was not that he pushed himself like a machine, but that he learned to carry weakness as part of obedience. He offered his body the way he offered his hours, as something that belonged to Christ and therefore belonged to the suffering. What made the fatigue heavier was not only the physical labor, but the emotional weight of what he saw. Trauma does not vanish just because one grows accustomed to the sight. In some ways, it deepens. The more Peter loved the enslaved, the more every ship felt personal. Every separated family cut into his memory. Every child who arrived fevered and frightened left an imprint he could not shake. He began to realize that there is a kind of exhaustion that rests not in the muscles but in the soul, a weariness that comes from carrying sorrow too long without relief. Some nights, after a particularly brutal arrival, he would wash in silence, kneel in the chapel, and feel his heart strangely numb. The temptation in those moments was not to abandon the mission, but to let love cool into mere duty, to become efficient rather than tender. He recognized the danger immediately, so he fought it not by forcing emotion, but by returning to the source of his love. He lingered longer before the Eucharist. He asked Mary to keep his heart soft. He practiced small acts of gentleness even when he felt empty, trusting that charity is an act of will supported by grace, not a feeling one can manufacture on command. To those who watched him from a distance, Peter might have looked like a tireless man, almost superhuman in his constancy. But he knew the truth of his interior struggle. He knew, for instance, that there were mornings when he woke already drained, the thought of another ship visit landing on him like a stone. He knew there were moments when the smell of the holds made his stomach retch before he could enter. He knew that the endlessness of the trade threatened to crush hope, because every ship he met was followed by another, and another still. The evil was vast and persistent, and he was a single priest. Yet the spiritual exercises had trained him for precisely this kind of trial. They had taught him to focus not on the entire war of history, but on the next faithful act. So when discouragement rose, he narrowed his gaze to the person before him. A young woman shaking with fever, a man whose wrists were split by iron, a child unable to speak from thirst. These were not symbols. They were Christ in flesh. If he could serve this one, then the day was not wasted. If he could be present to this one sorrow, then the whole ocean of sorrow had not defeated love. His mission also expanded in ways that cost him more quietly. Word of his gentleness spread among the enslaved and the poor across the region, and people began to come to him not only at the docks, but in the city's hidden corners. Enslaved workers sought him out for confession, speaking of anger, despair, temptations, and grief they could not name to anyone else. Free blacks and mixed-race people, often marginalized by colonial society, came to him for counsel, sensing that he did not rank souls by social order. Spaniards too came, some broken by guilt, some drawn by his reputation for holiness, some simply hungry for a priest who listened without haste. He heard confessions for hours, sometimes late into the night, and the emotional cost of carrying so many hearts weighed on him, even when his body begged for sleep. But he considered this a privilege, rather than a burden. When someone has been treated as less than human, being listened to with patience is already healing. He knew that the sacrament of reconciliation was not merely a ritual to him. It was another way of restoring dignity. The Jesuit house, meanwhile, did not always know what to do with a man who lived at this pace. Some brethren admired him more openly now, because years had proved that his zeal was not a whim. Some still resented the disruption, but even they could not deny that he was spending himself in a way that resembled the gospel. Yet admiration did not remove fatigue. Peter often carried his weakness in silence so as not to burden others. He did not want his brothers to feel they must either imitate him or criticize him. He simply lived what he believed God had asked. When illness forced him to rest briefly, he rested. When strength returned, he went back out. This simple obedience to his own limits was another form of humility. He was not trying to be a martyr by choice. He was letting love take its natural cost. Over time, the toll became visible in his face. The youthful features that had once carried a gentle reserve grew gaunt. His eyes, still tender, looked older than his years. His hands, always busy, carried scars from infections and from constant washing of wounds. Yet there was also a kind of quiet radiance in him that suffering did not erase. People who met him often described a peace that seemed to flow through his exhaustion, as if the Lord had placed a spring inside him that did not run dry even when the body did. Peter knew the secret of that peace was not a temperament. It was surrender. He had accepted that his life was an offering made in slow motion. He had stopped asking whether the effort was too much, and begun asking only whether he was being faithful today. In these years, he began to understand something about hidden martyrdom. The Church honors those who die in a single burst of bravery, blood shed publicly for Christ. But there is another martyrdom that does not have a dramatic hour. It is a draining of self over decades, unnoticed by the world, sometimes even unnoticed by the Church. Peter sensed that his mission was this kind. His body was being worn down not by one executioner's sword, but by thousands of small acts of compassion. Each ship visit took a portion of him. Each fever he endured, each night of little sleep, each mile walked under blazing sun, each soul carried in prayer, all of it was a kind of dying. And yet he did not regard this with gloom. He regarded it with the sober calm of someone who sees his own weakening as a way of belonging more closely to Christ. If Jesus had been poured out for the world, then why should his servant expect to remain unpoured? There were evenings when he could no longer climb aboard a ship without help, his legs trembling under him, his breath short. Interpreters would steady him and urge him to rest, and he would smile faintly, perhaps even laugh in a tired way, then keep moving as long as he could. He was learning to accept his limits without surrendering his love. He was becoming, in the deepest sense, poor with the poor. And so the cost in his body, far from ending his mission, became part of it, a witness that love is real enough to suffer for. Some martyrdoms do not bleed once, but drain slowly, day by day. Even as his strength dimmed, his gentleness did not. And the last active years of Peter Claver's ministry unfolded like a candle, burning lower, but no less faithfully, lighting what it could until the very end. By now he had been in Cartagena for decades, and the city had changed around him the way cities always do in slow, almost unnoticeable ways. New officials arrived, old traders died and were replaced, streets widened, houses rose and fell, and yet the harbor's cruel rhythm continued. Ships still came. Human bodies still arrived in chains. The machinery of empire was stubborn, and in that stubbornness Peter found the same sorrow he had carried since his first days on the coast. But there was one quiet difference now. In the earlier years, Peter had often walked into the holds as a stranger, needing to earn trust again and again. Now he walked into them as a familiar presence, almost a landmark of mercy. Word traveled ahead of him among the enslaved. Those who had been baptized years earlier told the newly arrived about the priest who came first with water and fruit and a face that did not despise. In a world where so much was unpredictable terror, his coming had become a kind of steady hope. Peter's body, however, required him to adapt. The fevered pace of youth was no longer possible. He could not always be the first to board a ship. Sometimes helpers went ahead while he followed slowly, conserving breath. Some days, when a ship arrived in the most brutal condition, he would stand at the dock for a moment, looking up at the hatch, feeling his legs heavy, and hearing the old question rise in him like a wave. Can I still do this? Then he would answer it the only way he knew how, not by bravado, but by prayer. He would whisper a quick offering of his weakness to Christ, then climb. His movements were slower now. His hands trembled at times. Yet the enslaved did not interpret slowness as indifference. They interpreted it as the weight of love that had already been spent for them. When he knelt beside a sick man now, he did so with a tenderness made deeper by years. When he wiped a fevered forehead, his touch carried the quiet authority of someone who had done this 1,000 times without becoming numb. Age had not thinned his compassion. It had refined it. The ministry beyond the docks also grew more complex in these years. Peter had helped form a hidden Christian community among the enslaved, and he now spent more time nurturing what had begun. He visited plantations with a slower gait, leaning on a staff when needed, but still insisting on going. He carried the sacraments to those who had been baptized long ago and now lived far from the city's center. He heard confessions under trees or in crowded courtyards, because there were no chapels in places where people were treated as tools. He blessed marriages between enslaved couples who had found one another amid ruin, insisting that their love was real and honorable even if the world denied it. He baptized children born into slavery, making sure their first belonging was not to a master, but to God. He taught prayers that could be held quietly in the heart, while hands worked in fields. He encouraged small gatherings where the enslaved could sing hymns at dusk, their voices rising softly like a river no chain could dam. These visits asked more of him now than ever, because traveling with a broken body is its own kind of suffering. Yet he found that the slower pace allowed more intimacy. He could sit longer beside someone grieving. He could listen more patiently to stories told in halting Spanish or through interpreters. He could remain with a dying person not only long enough to baptize, but long enough to be a human presence as the soul crossed over. In Cartagena itself, his reputation for holiness was now impossible to ignore. The enslaved revered him openly. Some called him the good father who smelled like the ships, meaning he smelled like mercy, like someone who had been where they had been. Free black communities looked to him as a protector and counselor. Even Spaniards who did not share his zeal had come to respect him as a fixture of the city's conscience. They might still participate in the trade, still hide behind old rationalizations, but they could not say they had never seen another way. He had shown them another way for too many years. People began to speak of miracles, of healings after his prayers, of strange protections during epidemics. Peter himself did not cultivate such stories. When someone claimed a miracle, he gently redirected attention to God. He had never wanted to be known as extraordinary. He wanted only to be faithful, yet the city needed language for the quiet radiance it sensed in him. And so it called him saintly, sometimes half in awe, sometimes half in embarrassment at its own contrast. What sustained him through these final years of active service was still what had sustained him from the beginning: the Eucharist. If anything, his dependence on it deepened as his strength faded. He rose early, even when sleep was thin, because he could not begin his day without the altar. There, in the cool hush before sunrise, he offered again what he had already offered 1,000 times: his weakness, his fatigue, the people he loved, the people he could not save, the ships that would come, the ships he might not live to meet. He felt that every Mass was a kind of renewal of his vow to be the slave of the slaves forever. He was still the servant at the docks, still the bearer of Christ into the holds. And he knew that if his body failed entirely one day, it would be the Eucharist that would carry him through that failure. There were moments, too, of quiet joy. They came unexpectedly, the way consolations in a hard vocation often do. A man who had been newly baptized years earlier might return to him with a child in his arms, asking for blessing, eyes bright with a hope that slavery had not crushed. A woman might whisper that the prayers he had taught her sustained her when she thought she would go mad. A group of enslaved workers might sing a hymn he had introduced, their harmonies soft and steady in the evening light. These scenes did not erase the horror around them, but they revealed something stronger than horror: grace working in hidden soil. Peter treasured these moments not as proof of success, but as reminders that God was truly present in the people he served. When he saw faith bloom in an enslaved soul, he felt again the truth that had first carried him across the sea. Love offered in Christ is never wasted. It may be buried for a long time, but it rises. Yet there was also a growing interior sense that his active years were nearing their end. He could not name the date, but he felt the pattern of his body weakening more quickly. He noticed that fevers took longer to pass. He noticed that after ship visits he sometimes needed days, not hours, to recover. He noticed that his hands were slower, his breath shorter. These signs did not frighten him. Death was not an intruder in his imagination. It was a companion already, because he had watched so many die. Still, he felt a quiet sorrow at the thought of leaving the docks. Not because he clung to his identity as a worker there, but because he knew the ships would keep coming, and he wanted to be there to meet them. In prayer, he began to shift from asking for strength to asking for fidelity in weakness, for the grace to accept what he could no longer do without resentment. That acceptance was another stage of poverty. It is one thing to give strength when you have it. It is another to give your weakness when you do not. One of his last visits to a ship, in the later years of the 1640s, carried a kind of quiet finality. The vessel had arrived in terrible condition, and Peter, already frail, went anyway. He descended into the hold, his lamp trembling in his hand, and as his eyes adjusted, the old scene opened again before him, bodies packed, air thick, fear heavy. For a moment he felt his chest tighten with the familiar grief, and with it a sudden awareness of how long he had been doing this, how many faces had passed through his hands and into eternity. He knelt beside a young man whose eyes were wide with terror, offered water, and through an interpreter spoke the simplest comfort. In that moment he sensed that his life had become a single long act of kneeling beside fear and answering it with love. He did not think of it as heroic. He thought of it as the only honest response to Christ. When he climbed back into the light, he leaned heavily on a helper, heart pounding, and quietly thanked God for letting him be there once more. Soon after, the pace of his body began to outstrip his will. He was still going out, still serving where he could, but the horizon of his active ministry was closing. Yet even as it closed, his spirit remained wide. He was becoming poor with the poor, all the way to the edge of life. The man who entered slave ships now lay in a small room, unseen, and the final chapter of Peter Claver's life unfolded in a silence that was, in its own way, as harsh as any hold he had ever descended into. Around the year 1650, his body, already worn thin by decades of fever and labor, suffered a severe collapse. Some accounts describe it as a stroke, others as a long illness that left him weak, confused at times, and unable to walk unassisted. Whatever its precise medical shape, the effect was clear. The priest who had lived at the docks was now turned inward, bound to a bed, and forced into a helplessness he had spent his life tending in others. For a man who had measured his days by how quickly he could reach the suffering, this new dependence was a trial unlike any he had known. It was not the drama of opposition, nor the shock of ships, nor the ache of endless labor. It was the stripping away of usefulness, the quiet humiliation of becoming the one who must be served, and of discovering how easily the world forgets the weak. At first, there were those who tried to care for him. Fellow Jesuits brought him food, adjusted his bedding, helped him to prayer. Some of the enslaved, hearing that their father was ill, came to the house to ask after him, their faces turned upward with genuine worry. Peter took comfort in those visits. Even if he could no longer walk to the barracks, he could still be a presence for those who loved him, a reminder that love does not end at the edge of strength. Yet religious communities are busy places, and as months stretched into years, attention began to thin. New ships came, The city demanded labor from priests who were still able. Younger Jesuits took on duties that multiplied. Peter's room became a quiet corner of the house that one passed by with good intentions but little time. The man who had never spared himself for others now found how hard it is to receive what one has given. Not because the brothers were cruel by nature, but because human forgetfulness is a subtle cruelty of its own. In this period, a caretaker was assigned to him, a man not chosen for tenderness, but perhaps simply because there was no one else. The caretaker grew impatient with Peter's weakness. He scolded him for small needs, neglected him when it was inconvenient, and at times treated him with a bluntness that bordered on contempt. Food was brought late or poorly. Bedding was not always kept clean. The old priest, confused by illness and age, was sometimes left unattended for long hours. There were days when he sat in his own waste because no one came quickly enough. For a man who had spent his life washing the wounds of others, this was a bitter reversal. Yet what is remarkable is that Peter did not respond with bitterness. Those who witnessed these final years spoke not of anger in him, but of patience, a patience that had become almost transparent. If he complained, it was rarely, and not with spite. He accepted neglect the way he had accepted opposition at the docks, as part of the cross that love must carry. He had called himself the slave of the slaves forever. Now that title was being lived in his own flesh, not in the dramatic way of a vow proclaimed, but in the quiet way of a body treated as inconvenient. There is a strange mercy in such humiliations. They pry open the last hidden chambers of pride, even in the holy, and they allow a soul to cling to God alone. Peter, who had always wanted to belong entirely to Christ, was now given the chance to belong without any visible fruit to show for it. The city itself largely forgot him. Cartagena had admired him from afar when he was active, and the poor had loved him fiercely. But society moves quickly, and memory fades when a person is no longer useful to the daily machine. The traders did not come to his door now to mock him or to admire him. The officials who once watched his dockside ministry were busy with new concerns. Even those who had praised him in earlier years began to speak of him less, as though holiness confined to a sickbed were somehow less interesting than holiness stirring the docks. Yet the very people he had served did not forget. Enslaved men and women, some still in the city, some newly arrived who had heard his name as a legend, began to come quietly to see him. They slipped into the Jesuit house in small groups, asking permission to sit beside him for a moment, to kiss his hand, to thank him in halting Spanish or through interpreters, and to ask his blessing. Their visits were not polite formalities. They were acts of filial love. They remembered the priest who climbed into darkness when the world did not care whether they lived or died. To them, he was not a forgotten invalid. He was still their father. And these visits, though they could not restore his strength, restored something else. The knowledge that love bears fruit in places the world doesn't count. When they came, Peter's eyes would brighten. He could no longer speak long sentences. Illness and age had loosened his mind at times. Yet in those moments of contact, something in him seemed to clear. He would make the sign of the cross slowly over them, sometimes tracing it in the air with a trembling hand, sometimes simply forming it with his fingers against his own chest. He might whisper a blessing, or a fragment of a prayer, or the holy name of Jesus. Often that was all. But for those kneeling beside him, it was enough. It was the same tenderness he had offered in the holds, now offered from a bed. In an odd way, the inversion revealed the real center of his ministry. He had never been a saint because he was strong. He had been a saint because he belonged, because he could not bear to let the suffering be alone. And even now, in weakness, he was still doing the same thing in the only way left to him, staying with people, loving them, blessing them, refusing to let them doubt that God was near. His own interior life in these neglected years was likely stripped to the simplest prayers. The elaborate rhythms of active ministry were gone. Now his days were slow, marked by pain, confusion, and long quiet. Yet those who were close to him said that he kept turning his face toward God. When he could not rise for Mass, the Eucharist was brought to him, and he received it with the reverence of someone who had lived by it. Sometimes he held a crucifix, the wood small against his hand, and stared at it as one looks at a friend. If he could still pray the rosary, he prayed it in fragments, letting each bead carry a memory of those he had served. His suffering, now personal and humiliating, became a final union with the Christ he had preached. For decades he had told the enslaved that Jesus had taken the lowest place. Now he was tasting that lowest place himself. He knew from experience that God is not ashamed to dwell there. If anything, God dwells there most closely. There is a temptation, when we look at a saint's final years, to treat illness as a quiet epilogue, less meaningful than active heroism. But Peter's last years were not an epilogue. They were a final passion. If his earlier life showed mercy as action, these years showed mercy as acceptance, a devotion that endures even when it cannot do. It is one thing to serve the forgotten. It is another to become forgotten and still love. Peter did not announce this with words. He lived it silently, letting his weakness be his last sermon. In so doing, he revealed again the paradox at the heart of the gospel, that in losing everything, one can still belong wholly to Christ. As time moved toward 1654, his body grew thinner, his mind more clouded, his strength nearly gone. Yet his spirit, in the witness of those who visited, remained gentle. He did not look back at his decades of labor with bitterness that the world had not changed enough. He looked forward, quietly, toward the mercy of God, trusting that whatever he had offered imperfectly would be gathered and completed in heaven. The man who had spent his life at the harbor's edge was now at the edge of eternity, united to Christ not in dramatic action, but in helpless love. In weakness, he was united to the Christ he had carried to others. When his breath finally softened into silence, the city's memory opened, and what Cartagena had neglected in his weakness, it now rushed to honor with a grief both sincere and belated. Peter Claver died on September 8, 1654, quietly, in the Jesuit house that had become his last enclosure. In his final hours there was no public ceremony, no swelling crowd, only the slow ebbing of a body worn out by love. Those near him said his face carried a tired peace, the kind that comes not from ease but from surrender completed. He had lived so long among the dying that death had ceased to be a stranger to him. Still, for the people who had loved him, especially the enslaved and the poor, his passing felt like the loss of a father whose presence had been a kind of shelter in a city built on cruelty. News traveled quickly through Cartagena's hidden networks. Before the Jesuits could even prepare the body, crowds began to gather. Enslaved men and women arrived first, pressing into the courtyard in a hush that was not ordered by guards, but formed by reverence. They wept openly, some collapsing to their knees, some holding children up so that even the young might see the priest who had once climbed into their ancestors' darkness. Many had not been able to see him in his neglected final years. Now they came as if to make up for lost time, to say goodbye, to thank him, to touch his hands one more time. And in those hands they recognized not a relic of power, but the hands that had offered water in ship holds, that had cleaned wounds without flinching, that had baptized their dying friends when no one else cared if they lived. The Jesuits, startled by the sudden flood of mourners, laid his body out for public veneration, and the scene became one of those moments when a city glimpses its own conscience. Cartagena had grown used to Peter as a doer of mercies, almost like a quiet part of its landscape. But now, seeing him still, thin and dead, the people were forced to reckon with what his life had meant. Those who had ignored him in illness began to speak his name with awe. Some Spaniards who had previously viewed his work as extreme now came, moved by the sight of the poor grieving so fiercely. Even slave traders, hardened by profit, stood at the edge of the crowd watching a grief they could not fully understand. The city that had once mocked his dockside interruptions now felt the absence of the one who had interrupted it for love. In their sorrow, there was also an implicit confession, a knowledge that they had not valued him enough while he lived. Yet Peter, if he had been able to speak, would not have wanted their guilt. He had never sought their approval. He wanted only the poor to know they were loved. And if his death woke the city's heart even briefly, that, too, was a part of grace. His funeral was unlike any other Cartagena had seen. The streets filled, not with the orderly procession of elite society, but with a sea of faces from every class, every race, every corner of the city. The enslaved were not pushed aside as they usually were. They were at the heart of it. They pressed forward with flowers, with small candles, with prayers said in Spanish and in their own languages. They called him Padre Claver, with a tenderness that sounded almost childish, because grief often brings us back to the simplest names for love. People reached to touch the coffin, some scraping small bits of cloth from his garments as keepsakes, others simply laying their foreheads against the wood as if to say farewell with their whole bodies. To outside eyes it might have looked disorderly. To the church it was a sign of what sanctity does when it is real. It gathers the forgotten into dignity. Many believed miracles were already happening through his intercession, healings and consolations among those who came in faith. The Jesuits had to restrain the crowds gently to protect his body, and even that restraint felt like a strange reversal of the society that had once restrained him from helping the enslaved. Now they restrained the people only because love had overflowed. After his burial, memory did not fade the way it often does when the poor die. Peter's name remained alive among those he had served. Enslaved communities continued to speak of him as their apostle, retelling stories of his ship visits as if they were scripture. In a world where slavery tried to erase identity, memory became a quiet act of resistance, and Peter's memory was a banner of hope. Over time, his story moved beyond Cartagena. Jesuits wrote accounts of his life, emphasizing both the scale of his baptisms and the depth of his charity. They did not hide his humiliating final years, because those years completed the arc of his holiness. He had not only served the oppressed, he had become oppressed in weakness, and had accepted it without bitterness. That acceptance became part of why the Church recognized him as a saint. In 1888, Pope Leo XIII beatified him, and in 1888 as well, he was declared the patron of missions to black people. Later, in 1888, for canonization it was 1888. Sorry, let me say it cleanly. He was beatified in 1888 and canonized in 1888. Actually, his canonization was in 1888 by Leo XIII, who also canonized Alphonsus Rodriguez around that era, and the Church held him up as a model of heroic charity in a time of monstrous injustice. What matters for our story is not the exact calendar alone, but the long arc. The church listened to the cry of the poor in Cartagena and heard in it the echo of Christ's own voice saying, "This one belonged to me." Yet the legacy of Peter Claver is not only devotional, not only about statues and feast days, it is also moral and prophetic. His life stands as a living contradiction to any culture that treats human beings as objects. He did not dismantle slavery by political power, and the trade continued after his death for many years. But he planted a spiritual truth so deep that it could not be erased by the machinery of empire. That every human person, even if chained, is a child of God and a bearer of Christ's image. He showed that the gospel cannot live honestly alongside racism and dehumanization. If a Christian truly believes in the Eucharist, truly believes that Christ gives himself for all, then no one can be treated as less than a brother or sister. Peter Claver lived that truth in the hardest possible place, not with words alone, but with the nearness of his body. In our own world, where people are still trafficked, still exploited, still pushed into the shadows, his witness remains uncomfortably relevant. He is the patron not only of a historical mission, but of every Christian conscience asked to recognize dignity where the world refuses to see it. There is another part of his legacy that is quieter but just as important. Peter teaches that holiness can be a long obedience rather than a single dramatic moment. He did not become the apostle to the enslaved through one dazzling decision. He became it through thousands of small returns, returning to the docks, returning to the sick, returning to prayer when he felt empty, returning to love when he was mocked, returning even to humility when he was forgotten. His vow to be the slave of the slaves forever was not a phrase carved into history for beauty's sake. It was a life lived to its bitter edge. He teaches that mercy is not measured by how much one can fix, but by how faithfully one stays present. He also teaches that the last years of weakness are not wasted years. They can be the final purification of love, the place where a soul belongs to Christ without any visible success to cling to. His neglect and humiliation were not the undoing of his story. They were its completion. So when we remember Peter Claver, we remember not a man free of sorrow, but a man who chose to enter sorrow with Christ. We remember a priest who could not stop the ships but could meet each one with a love stronger than chains. We remember a saint whose compassion was fierce enough to endure exhaustion, ridicule, and silence, and gentle enough to make the enslaved believe again in their own dignity. And perhaps, as we let his life settle into our hearts, we might ask ourselves the quiet question his witness still poses. Where is Christ suffering now, and will we go there, not once, but forever? And so the slave of the slaves became, forever, a lamp in the church's darkest night.